Bruce is the University Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University. He is a fellow of the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, the Southern Agricultural Economics Association, and the Western Agricultural Economics Association. He is the author of over 250 journal articles, 8 books, almost 60 book chapters, 68 government publications, and over 300 invited presentations, and then a bunch of other types of presentations which fall under other categories. In the area of climate change, Bruce has a publication research record that matches anybody, that goes back at least 20, almost probably 30 years. A large number of Bruce's publications deal with climate change, whether it's the economic implications of mitigation, of adaptation, the economic impacts of climate change on agricultural systems, you name it. He has some work that's looked at it. Another big area of Bruce's work deals with the interface between agriculture and forestry, which are 2 sectors that compete for land and other inputs. So again, he's one of the recognized experts there. He is a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 2007 assessment report, the chapter on agricultural mitigation. He is also was on the National Academy of Science panel for America's Climate Choices. So you get the idea. Currently, Bruce is looking at assessing the effects of climate change on agricultural productivity, looking at with a focus there on technological change and yield growth and CO2 effects. Another angle is assessing the economic environmental implications of growing crops on marginal lands. Recently, Bruce collaborated with a colleague, Brian Murray, who's at Duke University at the Nicholas School, to both motivate and edit a special edition of Choices. Choices is an open access journal of the American Agricultural Economics Association, and that special issue essentially was back to revisiting the evidence that's accumulated since 2007 on potential solutions to climate change within the agricultural sector. So his talk today is going to draw on that collection of work, and I will stop wasting your time and turn it over to Bruce.
Yeah, I must admit, when I first started on climate change, Jan Lewandowski was a master's student at Oregon State, and Rich Adams doing things, although he carefully avoided me and ran all the way down the hall every time he saw me coming. So what I want to do today is a 2-part presentation. The first part, I'm going to talk, is this thing active now?
I just wanted to make sure everyone can hear. I put it in the chat box. If people can't hear, please reply to the chat and let me know. Looks like, I'm hoping everyone can hear. So if you can't, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll assume you can.
So can you put the mouse active on the PowerPoint so I actually can control it? Good.
There you go.
Okay. So here's the thing Jan talked about. The web URL is there. Also, if you just search for Choices Magazine, all in one word, you can find this. There it is. Karen carefully said she needed to translate my slides into something that humans could read. And as a consequence, I don't understand the order entirely. But in the climate change business, we have 3 different things that we've looked at over time. We've spent a lot of money on effects and a lot of money on monitoring what's going on and forecasting what's going on. And actually, that's been where we've spent the most money of all from a governmental standpoint. But there's also issues of mitigation where we try to reduce drivers, like reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's issues of adaptation where we try to adapt better, equivalent to putting sunscreen on. If it's going to be warm and hot, you do some kind of thing. And in agriculture, all 3 of these things are quite relevant. The monitoring, where we're trying to figure out what's going on and forecast what might go on. The mitigation, where we talk about carbon sequestration, among other things. And the adaptation, where we talk about planting different crops and doing things that perform better under hotter conditions. There's one other little arrow on this diagram, which is conventional investment. When we spend money on these three things, we don't spend money on developing new computer technologies or improved energy delivery systems or things like that. So from an economic standpoint, the optimum mix of monies across all these things is a pretty big issue. Are we live on there? Because my little thing isn't.
Right.
There we go. The choices issue, and I need to move over a little bit, has 6 papers in it plus an overview. John Antle talks about climate change vulnerability and food insecurity, largely in an international setting. I can't remember her first name, but Blanc and John Riley out of MIT are looking at what the assessments have said about U.S. crops. Steve Rose, who used to be with EPA and is now with the Electric Power Research Institute, did stuff on the inevitability of climate change. I actually went back in on a paper and elaborated on this, on what Rose said, which is what I'm going to cover for the rest of this presentation. And then Brian Murray talked about how come when we were so optimistic in 2000 and the late 1990s about carbon markets, why hadn't much happened yet? And Jan talked about a whole bunch of different programs that could contribute to carbon markets, along with Katie's book. Is that the right name? So anyhow, I encourage you to go take a look at these if you're interested in the topic. The other thing I might say is CFAIR was part of this, and I'm on the CFAIR Climate Change Committee. And if you're interested in being on that committee, you certainly ought to contact us, and we'll see if we can. We're thinking of reconstituting the membership a little bit and are interested in getting some people who really want to help with the public outreach side of the climate change issue. Now, you can see here how the different papers go into the mitigation and effects and adaptation part. I've already talked about that. So I'm going to cover adaptation. Now, adaptation really refers to a set of adjustments in natural or human-managed systems in response to climate change. This adaptation can be done by private individuals, and we're seeing a lot of that today with people applying more pesticides or changing pest treatment or shifting where crops are. It can also be done publicly. From an economist perspective, the public role is to correct for public goods that are adaptation actions that would be underinvested in by private individuals. And then finally, there's a natural adaptation that's here, and I'll have a few more words to say about that in a minute. Now, the first argument I want to make is about the inevitability of adaptation. This is a picture here from the IPCC report. It's actually from a journal article written by some of those people. And I'm going to divide the future into 2 different eras. Between now and about 2040, which is the red line on this picture, notice we get about a degree of climate change no matter what happens with the other little red and blue and other colored lines. Those different lines out there, they show up differently out on the far right-hand side of the diagram, are what we call RCPs, which are representative concentration pathways, which translates to different amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, with the red one being business as usual and the blue one being stopping emissions right now and everybody moving to Disneyland, because that one isn't going to happen. Notice in era 1, what happens with controlling greenhouse gas emissions doesn't matter. It pretty much, we get 1 degree of warming no matter which of those scenarios we're after. When we get out here to era 2, which is 2100, this is what we called in IPCC the era of climate choices. This is where our mitigation activities really have a big difference. Notice the real ones there are not that blue one on the bottom, but there's that light blue one, the orange one, and the red one. And that's pretty much a change between 2 and 4 degrees. Now, what this says to me is between now and 2040, just about no matter what we do on the mitigation side, we've got to have agriculture be capable of operating in a 1 degree warmer environment. And by 2100, it's got to be 2 to 4 degrees. This means regardless of the mitigation activity, agriculture has to adapt to this spectrum of things. How can we produce when it's 1 degree hotter? And there's a whole other host of things that comes along with this. Changes in rainfall intensity, changes in precip in different areas, more or less extreme events, etc. But the point is we have to anticipate these things and develop some of our technologies that take a long time to develop to address these things now. So why adapt? Well, climate change forcing. There's also a long lag time between mitigation action and Earth system response. This climate change, I think, is largely inevitable, and I think it's fair to say that we've been somewhat slow in taking mitigation actions in a number of different arenas. Now, let's talk a little bit about the types of adaptation. Now, in the literature, they say there's natural adaptation, there's autonomous adaptation, and there's planned adaptation. To an economist, these kind of suck as ways of saying things. Basically, the natural is natural. The autonomous is private actions taken in their own best interests by private parties. The planned is things done by the federal government and other governing agencies. The private ones are where people pursue private goods. I'm going to change my livestock species because this one performs better under hotter conditions, and they do it in their profit-seeking motives. The planned ones, or what I like to call the public ones, are addressing public goods. What individual is going to build a seawall? I mean, nobody's going to build a seawall. What individual is going to develop drought-resistant varieties of corn? Those are public goods, hard to capture the public gains. Those are going to be larger enterprises. The public sector, in this particular case, can support autonomous information through extension, or autonomous adaptation through extension, through development of technologies, by building irrigation dams and things like that. So they support it through information. They do research and development to adapt things. And then they also can influence natural. One of the findings under climate change is who's from New England. No more sugar maples in New Hampshire. So what you could do as a public sector is manage the unmanaged. Go collect a bunch of seeds, drive up into Ontario, and spread them around. I heard some woman saying she was in California in an area where the habitat for an endangered butterfly was about to go against the butterfly, and she thought about taking her net, capturing a bunch of them, and driving them to another valley and turning them loose. I mean, that's managing the unmanaged. If there's an ecologist on this thing, they just turned green and said, no, we can't do that, but we may have to. I always think about building little floats for polar bears. You know, they can't be on the ice. Well, we'll build them a little raft and put it out there somewhere. Now, throughout history, agriculture has been the #1 adaptive sector. I mean, in Texas, we grow corn, but we grow it very differently than we grow it in Indiana, than we grow it in other parts of the world. And agriculture is good at this, but the pace of this adaptation may be unprecedented. You know, in the past, we haven't had to do adaptation as rapidly. In a lot of the developing countries, the way somebody learns how to manage the land is they ask their father and their grandfather what they did to manage that land. But now the things that they've been able to do for a long time may no longer be satisfactory. And this pace, and there's also place and context-specific things. We're growing more cotton in southern Colorado than we ever did. We're growing more corn in South, North, in the Dakotas than we did before. These are climate change adaptations. Now, there's a vast array of things that can be done. There's some actions that are mainly private, like altering patterns of management and altering locations. There's some things that are mainly public, like emergency response, changing norms and regulations, managing the unmanaged, and directly capital investments. And then there's some partnership items. Crop varieties, I said no individual is going to do that, but DuPont might do that. However, the U.S. Government may well get involved too. There's creating information, there's educational processes, there's, say, altering crop insurance to better accommodate adaptation. There's providing incentives for individuals to do things, and there's providing loans to cause things to happen. So there's a mix across the spectrum of what can be done. In crop and livestock, we've certainly seen adaptation going on through timing, stocking rates, pest treatments, changing in breeds, provision of irrigation, moving patterns that worked well in the U.S. in the South up into more northern things, and then investing in research and extension, moving infrastructure. This, in Norway, they're currently taking salmon pens and discontinuing them in the south and moving them up to the north because of pathogens. But that also means you have to move up some airports, you have to move up some fish processing facilities, trucks, roadways. In a minute, I'll make a further argument about this in the U.S. context. Now, this adaptation is happening. She made me what do they call this, animation? I hate animations. Oh, well. The average acre of wheat since 1950 in the U.S. has moved north and west about 173 miles. About half of that's probably due to climate. There's some technological things that also contributed. The average acre of corn has gone north and west about 150 miles. So we've seen changes in this. This is actually moving corn away from the Mississippi River. It's going to change the barge industry. It also puts corn in place of wheat. The wheat yields average 44 bushels an acre. Corn yields average 165 bushels an acre. We have 4 times as much to move. That means stronger roads, stronger bridges, processing facilities. It also puts more on the rails going east and west than going down the Mississippi to New Orleans. So it changes our infrastructure demands. It changes our grain transport demands. We did econometric work looking at what happens as the temperature changes. That's the horizontal acre. What do you call it? Axis here, horizontal acre. And on the other axis is the probability of a land use. We'll notice that at the lower temperatures, you have a 60% probability the land use will be cropland and a 20% chance, or 25, is going to be in pasture. But notice as it gets warmer, the probability the cropland goes down, the probability the pasture goes up. We're going to begin to see these land use changes. We also looked at stocking rates in an econometric setting. Notice those little boxes out there on the left-hand side show that as it gets warmer under climate scenarios, we expect the stocking rates to decrease. I mean, that's kind of obvious. If you look at West Texas, we have 1 animal every 100 acres. If you look at East Texas, we have 1 animal every acre. And there's a change in temperature and precipitated regime across that. And finally, here's my colored spaghetti diagram. This shows holding the precip constant as you change the temperature gradient, what's going to happen? Over here at 40 degrees, we're dominated by spring wheat. As it gets a little warmer, we start seeing soybeans and corn come in. As it gets a little warmer, here comes cotton and something else, sorghum. And then as it gets really warm, this thing went to rice, although we didn't have the option of going into pasture land here, and that probably would take a much more prominent role. But this just sort of shows crops working on their sweet spot. And as things get warmer, we tend to see these things moving a little further north and a little further west to get back in the sweet spot. One other key concept is that of maladaptation. The example I usually use is New Orleans. You know, we're rebuilding New Orleans right now, and we're making it resistant to a storm like Katrina. Well, that's going to make a whole bunch of more people move back into New Orleans. They're going to invest more money. If the sea level rise comes up by the end of the century by as much as 2.5 feet, which is the top end, that's going to worsen the damages. So that's a maladaptation case. It's a case where actions for one people worsen the vulnerability and exposure of some other people, whether they be in the future or in another place. You can also have maladaptation against the poor, and things that you do now may limit future choices. You know, if you build a big dam now, but in the future it needs to be bigger, it's hard to enlarge those things. Maladaptation can be economically rational. That's not really recognized in the literature. You can, you know, if you spend money now and save a whole bunch of benefits now, but in the future they're costs, we have the standard cost benefit and discounting weighting that we as economists think about. Adaptation limits. Adaptation capacity is uneven across and within societies. There's substantial limits. There's a wide spectrum of things that could be suggested. There are some things we might have the resources to do. There are other things that we can convince people to do. So there's kind of a narrowing from the total universe down to the set of things we can do. I'll make two other points kind of quickly. A few years ago, I was asked by the IPCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to make an estimate of the global cost of adaptation. Now, if you want to have fun as an economist, just think about this. Somebody calls you up and says, we want you to estimate the cost of adaptation in fisheries, forestry, and agriculture globally. And by the way, you have 3 weeks to do it. So I did it. It's probably the worst piece of economic research I ever did in my life. But here are the results. Annual bill for adaptation is between 5 and 13 billion. The reference is on the previous slide. You can go look at the hieroglyphics that were behind it. But the issue here is we have this externality. The externality is caused by certain people, and other people are absorbing the cost. The low-level islands off of New Zealand have negotiated with New Zealand to move there when they go underwater. Well, should they pay for that, or should we pay for that? This was behind the establishment of the Adaptation Fund, although I think there's a lot more work that has to be done. My only vindicating point about this is Martin Perry set some guy to review my estimates, and he spent 8 months doing it and came up with the same numbers. And Martin Perry said, what do you think? And I said, I think your guy's too slow. The final point I'll make is we set up an optimal control model using DICE. You all know what DICE is. It's one of Nordhaus's models. DICE is the one because we didn't have the regional one, which is called RICE. And we put adaptation facilities into it. It didn't have it. And the adaptation facilities were that the more money you spend on adaptation, the less damages you avoid. As you do spend money on damages, you do avoid, on adaptation, you avoid damages. So we had diminishing marginal productivity. We also had, the more the climate change is, the more costly it is to do the adaptation. We stuck that in the model. We also had competition with traditional uses of funds, and we looked at the optimal share of adaptation versus mitigation, and notice in current times it says you ought to spend 80% of your money on adaptation and about 20% of your money on mitigation, and when we get out to 2185, we're at about a 50-50 mix. The reason for this kind of share is adaptation's the Band-Aid. It's done now, you spend money now, you get benefits now. Mitigation takes a longer time to evolve, and the returns to mitigation increase the more climate change you've got. So this thing puts more money into mitigation, the worse that the situation gets. Obviously, the cost of carbon, the cost of a release is going to get worse over time, and that's when it goes into that. I'm not saying that these numbers are take-to-the-bank numbers, but on the other hand, I think they're interesting. It's, again, the adaptation imperative. We got to do it now, and we also need to pursue mitigation, but on the other hand, maybe adaptation's a shorter-run strategy and mitigation's a longer-run. So agriculture will have to adapt at unprecedented rates. We probably face a degree of climate change by 2040 and 2 to 4 degrees by 2100. It requires both public and private action. A lot of the action is going to happen at private individuals adjusting their things. But what we may need to do is foster those things and create and act on the things that are public goods. There are many possible strategies that will require large investments. It's happening now, but it does have its limits.